The word is Iroquois and it's spelt Iroquois. Well, Iroquois is a word we've used since about the 17th century to refer to a group of Native Americans, or what we used to call Indians, and some still use the word Indian, from the sort of northern United States and Canada. And this particular group of peoples were named by the French. The Iroquois is a name given by the French, who were coming into what they then called New France, La Nouvelle France, and we now call Canada. They were coming there to settle, to hunt, to trap beaver, to trade. And when they landed in Canada, they encountered all kinds of peoples, some of whom they found friendly and some of whom they found quite hostile. And we might fully understand the hostility today, particularly knowing the colonial history of the Americas. And of course, we don't really know to what extent the people were genuinely hostile and violent and viciously aggressive and cannibals, as the Iroquois were seen as cannibals by the French, and to what extent this is a representation that the French made of them, as the English were also, of course, making their representation of the Native Americans, because they want to settle, they want to colonise, they want to enclose land, they want to have all the resources for themselves. Well, we have different perspectives on the Iroquois depending whether it comes from the English or the French, because the Iroquois on the whole were allies of the English and therefore enemies of the French. The French were allies with a different people whom they named the Hurons, and it may indeed be a Huron word from which the French got the term Iroquois, a word meaning black snake or adder or something like that. In other words, a very negative representation. So the French see the Iroquois as being people into whose hands you really would not wish to fall, because they, as the French see them, naturally very, very violent, aggressive, hostile. They take huge pleasure from torturing their enemies. So they will tie you up, they will torture you with fire, they will cut little pieces off you and eat these little pieces in front of you, and so on and so forth. So the French focus on that. We have a lot of letters home from Jesuits, and that's a great source of information on the native peoples, or on the land generally. And so the Jesuit relations recounts at great length scenes of torture and so on. Well, the name that the Iroquois use for themselves is Haudenosaunee. I'm not completely sure how to pronounce that, not being an expert on those languages at all. But that means people of the Longhouse, and so that has, I guess, connotations of their role as a confederacy of bringing together 5 or 6 nations, of it has a sense of cohesiveness and so on, whereas the term Iroquois has a sense of killer people, something like that. There's one of the potential sources of the word I've mentioned. There might be Huron source, it could be a Basque source, and that would be the killer people source. So it has very negative representations. Well, my interest is in the Enlightenment representations of native peoples. And I regard the Enlightenment in a very broad way as not just the 18th century, but from sort of mid-17th century up till early 19th century. And how this philosophical movement, if you like, with its belief in progress, represented the indigenous peoples. And in that period, we get the birth of what people now call the noble savage, or the good savage. And that uses the image of a person who is stripped of the bad things of civilization, if you like, who has natural reason, natural wisdom, and doesn't have all these, say, the vices of civilization. While we may see this as being an anti-colonial gesture on the part of the philosophers of the Enlightenment, it's two-edged, because seeing the natural man, the noble savage, and of course the very word savage is an interesting one, but that's another question. Seeing the natural man as somebody who doesn't have possessions, who is very troubled by property, who has a natural religion, for example, rather than all the trappings of authority and state, can also lead us to say, well, since they don't have possessions, since they don't really understand land ownership as we do, perhaps we need to get in there and cultivate the land and make it, husband the land, as they used in the period, land husbandry. We need to make it produce. We need to use it to its maximum. We can't. It's all very well. These people don't really care. They just float over the land with a very light step, and they won't really mind if we go and enclose it for agriculture or whatever. And you can see where that goes.